The summer heat of 1935 pressed down on Harlem like a heavy hand, turning the streets into rivers of sweat and desperation. But inside the cool shadow of a brownstone on 139th Street, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson sat perfectly still, a king in his kingdom, watching the world through eyes that had seen more violence before breakfast than most men saw in a lifetime. They called him Bumpy, a nickname earned from a childhood injury that left a permanent lump on the back of his skull. But to the people of Harlem, he was something more than a man with a peculiar name. He was power incarnated, respect personified, and at 30 years old, he had already carved his name into the underworld with a blade sharp enough to cut through the prejudice, poverty, and brutality that defined life for a black man in Depression-era America. True crime, drug lord, 1987 history, government conspiracy, war on drugs, political assassination, criminal empire, faceless narration, documentary, cartel history, untold history, Latin America, Reagan era, international politics, true story, historical events, crime documentary, government secrets, drug trafficking, hidden history, narco history, cocaine cartel, betrayal story, government operations, CIA operations, drug war history, 1980s crime, political intrigue, narco kingpin, faceless channel. Bumpy wasn't tall, standing just 5 feet 9 inches, but he carried himself with the bearing of someone much larger, someone whose physical presence was amplified by an aura of controlled menace. His skin was dark as polished mahonia, his jaw set in a permanent expression of calculation, and his eyes, those eyes, they moved slowly, deliberately, taking in every detail of a room, every twitch of a man's face, every betrayal hidden behind a smile. He dressed impeccably, even in the suffocating heat, his three-piece suits pressed to perfection, his shoes shone in mirrors because in Harlem, appearance was armor, and Bumpy Johnson never went into battle unprepared. He had come up through the ranks the hard way, starting as a street hustler in South Carolina before migrating north during the Great Exodus, when black families fled the lynch mobs and Jim Crow laws for the promised land of northern cities. But what they found in places like New York was a different kind of oppression, subtler perhaps, but no less deadly. The Italian mobs controlled the numbers racket, the speakeasies, the protection schemes, and they treated black entrepreneurs like sharecroppers, taking the lion's share while offering scraps in return. Bumpy had watched this dynamic for years, studying it the way a chess master studies an opening gambit, and he had decided with the cold clarity that defined all his decisions that he would change the game entirely. By 1935, he had become the enforcer for Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Madam Queen of Harlem's numbers racket, a French-speaking immigrant from Martinique who refused to bow to the Italian syndicates. She was brilliant, ruthless, and she recognized in Bumpy a kindred spirit, someone who understood that respect couldn't be begged for, it had to be taken, often at gunpoint. Together, they had built an empire in Harlem, protecting black-owned businesses, running the numbers with efficiency that put the Italians to shame, and establishing a reputation that made even the most hardened mobsters think twice before crossing into their territory. But empires, Bumpy had learned, attracted predators. Dutch Schultz was one such predator. Born Arthur Simon Flegenheimer in the Bronx, Schultz had reinvented himself as a bootlegger and gangster, building a criminal organization that stretched across New York City. He was violent, unpredictable, and deeply paranoid, a combination that made him both dangerous and vulnerable. More importantly, he was greedy, and the Harlem numbers racket, which pulled in thousands of dollars every week, had caught his attention like blood in water attracts sharks. Schultz didn't understand Harlem. He didn't understand the intricate web of loyalty, respect, and community that held the neighborhood together, didn't understand that the numbers weren't just a business but a lifeline for families who bet nickels and dimes on a chance to feed their children. To Schultz, Harlem was just another territory to conquer, another revenue stream to control, and the black operators like Bumpy and Madam St. Clair were obstacles to be removed or subordinated. The tension had been building for months. Schultz's men had started appearing in Harlem, leaning on small-time operators, collecting protection money, and making it clear that new management was taking over. At first, it was subtle, a quiet squeeze designed to avoid open warfare. But Bumpy had seen the pattern before. This was how invasions started, with small incursions that tested resolve, and if that resolve faltered, the flood would follow. Madame St. Clair had wanted to negotiate to find some accommodation that would preserve their operation while avoiding bloodshed, but Bumpy had advised against it. Negotiation, he told her, was just another word for surrender when you were dealing with men like Schultz. The moment you showed weakness, the moment you blinked, they would take everything, and they would do it with a smile. On a Wednesday afternoon in late July, the confrontation that had been building for months finally erupted. Bumpy was at the Cotton Club not to enjoy the music or the dancers, but to meet with several independent operators who were feeling the pressure from Schultz's organization. White mobsters technically owned the Cotton Club, but it catered to white clientele who came uptown to experience what they called exotic entertainment, watching black performers from a safe distance, separated by an invisible but very real color line. Bumpy hated the place, hated the hypocrisy of it, the way white patrons could enjoy black culture while maintaining their superiority, the way black performers had to enter through the back door of their own club. Still, it was neutral ground, and neutral ground was important when you were trying to prevent a war. He sat in a booth in the back, away from the main floor, with three men who ran smaller numbers operations in different parts of Harlem. They were scared, and Bumpy didn't blame them. Schultz's reputation for violence was well-earned, and these men had families, responsibilities, and no desire to become martyrs. He's offering us 25%, one of them said. A thin man named Marcus, who ran operations out of a barbershop on Lenox Avenue, says we can keep running our routes, keep our collectors, but he takes 75% off the top. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch out, watching Marcus squirm, watching the other two men exchange nervous glances. Fear was contagious, and if he didn't contain it here, it would spread through Harlem like plague. 25% of what you earn, Bumpy said, finally, his voice low and measured, or 25% of what you used to earn before you started starving because you can't feed your family on scraps. Marcus looked down at his hands. I got kids, Bumpy. I can't go to war with Dutch Schultz over percentages. It's not about percentages, Bumpy said, and now there was an edge to his voice, sharp as broken glass. It's about whether you're going to die on your feet or live on your knees. Schultz thinks he can come into Harlem and treat us like field hands. You take his deal, you're not his partner, you're his slave, and when he's done squeezing every penny out of you, he'll replace you with someone cheaper. One of the other men, a heavy-set operator named Jerome, cleared his throat. What about Madame St. Clair? What does she say? She says the same thing I'm saying, Bumpy lied smoothly. In truth, Stephanie was still hoping for a diplomatic solution, but Bumpy knew diplomacy was dead the moment Schultz started making threats. We stand together or we fall apart. That's always been the rule in Harlem. Before anyone could respond, the atmosphere in the Cotton Club changed. Bumpy felt it before he saw it, that subtle shift in energy that came when predators entered a space. The music continued, the dancers kept dancing, but conversations died mid-sentence and heads turned toward the entrance. Dutch Schultz had arrived. He walked in like he owned the place, which in a sense he did, having intimidated the nominal owners into giving him a stake in the operation. He was accompanied by four men, all of them wearing the kind of expensive suits that screamed organized crime, all of them carrying the unmistakable bulge of concealed weapons. Schultz himself was shorter than his reputation suggested, with pale skin, thinning hair, and eyes that moved constantly, paranoid and calculating in equal measure. He spotted Bumpy immediately, and Bumpy saw the recognition flash across his face, followed by something else, something that looked like contempt mixed with curiosity. Schultz changed direction, moving toward Bumpy's booth with the confident stride of someone who had never been told no, his men flanking him like a military escort. Bumpy didn't stand. He didn't even shift position. He simply watched Schultz approach, his face expressionless, his hands resting on the table where everyone could see them. The three operators with him looked like they wanted to melt into the floor. Bumpy Johnson, Schultz said when he reached the booth, his voice carrying a thick New York accent. I've been hoping to run into you. Mr. Schultz, Bumpy replied, keeping his tone neutral. Quite a coincidence. Schultz smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in opportunities. And right now, I'm looking at an opportunity for us to come to an understanding. I'm listening, Bumpy said. Schultz glanced at the three operators, dismissing them with a look. This is a private conversation. You boys should take a walk. Bumpy raised a hand before any of them could move. They're with me. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of them. For a moment, genuine anger flashed across Schultz's face, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. He wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by someone he clearly viewed as beneath him. Fine, Schultz said, sliding uninvited into the booth across from Bumpy. His men remained standing, forming a wall of muscle and menace. I'll make this simple. Harlem is changing management. The freelance operation you and that French bitch have been running is over. From now on, all number operations in this neighborhood go through me. You can work for me, take a salary, keep doing what you're doing, or you can walk away. Those are your options. Bumpy let the silence stretch again, studying Schultz's face. The man was nervous beneath that bravado. Bumpy could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers drummed against the table. Schultz had power, resources, and political connections, but he was operating in foreign territory, and he knew it. That's generous, Bumpy said finally, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But I'm going to have to decline. Schultz's expression darkened. You're making a mistake. I've made plenty of mistakes, Bumpy said. This isn't one of them. Part 1 complete. May I continue with Part 2? Yes, 21:33, Part 2, the confrontation. Dutch Schultz leaned back in the booth, his eyes narrowing as he processed Bumpy's refusal. The ambient noise of the Cotton Club seemed to fade into background static, the laughter and music becoming distant and irrelevant as the space between the two men charged with electricity. Bumpy could feel the three operators beside him tense, could sense their fear like a physical presence, but he kept his focus entirely on Schultz, reading every micro-expression, every tell that might indicate what would come next. "You think you're smart," Schultz said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think because you've got this neighborhood fooled into thinking you're some kind of Robin Hood that makes you untouchable. But let me educate you about how the world really works. I've got judges in my pocket. I've got cops on my payroll. I've got more guns and more men than you can count. What do you have? A bunch of niggers playing numbers in the street?" The word hung in the air like poison gas, and Bumpy felt something cold and ancient settle in his chest. That familiar rage that he'd learned to control but never eliminate. The fury that came from a lifetime of being treated as less than human by men who wouldn't survive a day in his shoes. He saw Marcus flinch beside him, saw Jerome's hands ball into fists under the table, but Bumpy himself didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give Schultz the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made smart men check their exits. "Mr. Schultz," Bumpy said, his voice carrying a lethal calm, "I'm going to give you one chance to walk out of here with your dignity intact. Take your men, leave Harlem, and forget you ever had this conversation. Because if you don't, I'm going to teach you something about how the world really works in my neighborhood." Schultz's face flushed red, and Bumpy knew in that moment that violence was inevitable. There were men whose pride could absorb an insult, who could calculate the cost of escalation and choose discretion, but Schultz wasn't one of them. He was a man whose entire identity was built on never backing down, never showing weakness, and Bumpy had just challenged that identity in front of witnesses. "You threatening me?" Schultz said, his voice rising. "You think you can threaten me in my own club?" "Your club?" Bumpy said, and now his voice carried an edge of mockery. "You don't own anything up here, Schultz. You're a tourist playing gangster in a place you don't understand. These people don't fear you. They tolerate you. There's a difference." Schultz stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a scream. His men immediately moved closer, hands sliding inside their jackets toward concealed weapons. The entire Cotton Club had gone silent now, even the band stopping mid-song as everyone sensed the imminent explosion of violence. "I'm done being polite," Schultz said, his voice shaking with rage. "You've got 24 hours to bring Madame St. Clair to me, ready to sign over her operations, or I'm going to burn Harlem to the ground, starting with everyone you care about, and you uppity." He didn't finish the sentence. Bumpy moved with a speed that surprised everyone, including himself, rising from the booth and driving his fist into Schultz's solar plexus with enough force to double the man over. In the same motion, Bumpy grabbed a bottle from the table and brought it down on the head of the nearest bodyguard, who went down like a felled tree, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. The other three guards reacted instantly, pulling guns, but Bumpy had already grabbed Schultz by the collar and spun him around, using him as a human shield. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 3 seconds, and now the Cotton Club erupted into chaos, patrons screaming and diving under tables, staff running for exits, and the operators who had been sitting with Bumpy scrambling to get out of the line of fire. "Put the guns down," Bumpy said, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority, "or I break his neck right here." He had Schultz in a chokehold now, one arm wrapped around the man's throat, the other hand gripping his head in a position that could snap his spine with one sharp twist. Schultz was gasping, clawing at Bumpy's arm, his face turning purple, and his men stood frozen, guns drawn but unable to shoot without hitting their boss. For a moment, everything balanced on a knife's edge. Bumpy could feel Schultz's pulse racing against his forearm, could smell the man's fear sweat mixing with expensive cologne, could sense the calculations running through the minds of the three gunmen, trying to figure out if they could take a shot, if their boss would survive, if they would survive the aftermath. Then the decision was made for them. The Cotton Club's manager, a nervous white man named Clarence, who answered to the same Italians who answered to Schultz, came running out of the back office with his own gun drawn, shouting something about police, about everyone needing to calm down, about this being a respectable establishment. Bumpy knew he had seconds to make a choice. He could kill Schultz right here, right now, and the war would be immediate and total, or he could let him go, accept that this confrontation had crossed a line from which there was no return, and prepare for what came next. He chose a third option. With a sudden motion, Bumpy hurled Schultz forward into his own men, sending all four of them stumbling backward in a tangle of limbs and weapons. In the confusion, Bumpy grabbed Marcus by the collar and shoved him toward the back exit, shouting at Jerome and the third operator to run. He could hear Schultz screaming behind him, hear the sound of guns being cocked, hear Clarence still shouting about police, but Bumpy's mind had already moved past the immediate chaos to the next phase, to the escape, to the war that would begin before sunrise. He burst through the back door into an alley that reeked of garbage and human waste, pulling Marcus along with Jerome and the other man right behind them. The summer heat hit them like a wall after the air-conditioned interior of the club, and for a moment Bumpy paused, listening for pursuit, calculating angles and distances. "Go," he said to the three operators. "Get off the streets, find somewhere safe. Don't go home, don't go to your regular spots. Find somewhere Schultz can't find you and stay there until you hear from Madame St. Clair." "Bumpy, what did you just do?" Marcus said, his voice high with panic. "Do you know what you just did?" "I did what needed to be done," Bumpy said. "Now move." They scattered into the Harlem night, disappearing into alleys and doorways with the practiced ease of men who knew how to vanish. Bumpy stood alone for a moment, listening to the distant sound of sirens, knowing that Clarence had made good on his threat to call the police, knowing that Schultz's men would be flooding into this alley any second. He ran north, keeping to the shadows, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. He needed to get to Madame St. Clair, needed to warn her that the war had begun, needed to mobilize their network of soldiers and informants before Schultz could strike first. His lungs burned, his dress shoes were never meant for running, and he could feel his shirt soaking through with sweat, but he didn't slow down. He made it 3 blocks before they caught up to him. The car came out of nowhere, a black Packard that screeched around the corner and cut him off, forcing Bumpy to skid to a halt. 3 men piled out, and Bumpy recognized them as Schultz's crew, not the ones from the Cotton Club, but reinforcements who must have been stationed nearby. They had guns drawn, and Bumpy's hand moved instinctively to his own weapon, a .38 revolver he kept in a shoulder holster, but he never cleared leather. The first bullet hit him in the left shoulder, spinning him around with the force of impact. The pain was instant and overwhelming, white-hot agony that spread from the wound site through his entire upper body. He stumbled, trying to stay on his feet, trying to return fire, but the second bullet caught him in the thigh, and his leg buckled beneath him. He went down hard on the pavement, his vision swimming, his ears ringing from the gunshots, echoing off the close walls of the tenement buildings. He could hear screaming, could hear windows slamming shut as residents decided that whatever was happening on the street was none of their business, could hear the sound of car doors opening and footsteps approaching. Through the haze of pain, Bumpy saw one of Schultz's men standing over him, gun pointed at his head. The man was young, maybe 25, with the kind of hard eyes that came from seeing too much violence too early. "Mr. Schultz says you should have taken the deal," the young man said. Bumpy tried to speak, tried to say something defiant, something that would preserve his dignity in what he assumed were his final moments, but all that came out was a wet cough that tasted like copper. Blood was pooling beneath him, spreading in a dark stain across the sidewalk, and he could feel his strength draining away with each heartbeat. The young man raised his gun for the execution shot, and Bumpy closed his eyes, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion, thinking about Madame St. Clair, thinking about Harlem, thinking about all the things he'd left undone. The shot never came. Instead, he heard shouting, heard the sound of more cars arriving, heard someone yelling "police" in a voice that carried authority. Through his dimming vision, Bumpy saw the young man lower his gun and run, saw the other 2 gunmen scrambling back to their Packard, saw the car peel away into the night. Then there were hands on him, voices above him, someone pressing something against his shoulder to stop the bleeding. He tried to focus on the face leaning over him, tried to determine if this was friend or enemy, but consciousness was slipping away like water through his fingers. The last thing he heard before darkness took him was a voice saying, "Get him to Harlem Hospital, and someone better call Madame St. Clair before this whole neighborhood burns." Bumpy Johnson woke to pain so intense it felt like he was being born again, every nerve ending screaming in protest against consciousness. The ceiling above him was cracked plaster, water-stained and yellowing, and the smell that filled his nostrils was a nauseating mixture of antiseptic, blood, and human suffering. Harlem Hospital, he realized, was the place where black bodies came to be patched up or prepared for the grave, whichever fate the universe had decided. He tried to move and immediately regretted it. His left shoulder was wrapped in bandages that felt tight enough to cut off circulation, and when he attempted to shift his leg, lightning bolts of agony shot through his thigh. Someone had removed his suit, his armor, leaving him in a thin hospital gown that did nothing to preserve his dignity. He felt vulnerable in a way that was almost worse than the physical pain, exposed and weak in a world that punished weakness without mercy. "Don't try to move." The voice came from his right, and Bumpy turned his head carefully to see a Negro doctor standing beside the bed, a man in his 40s with graying hair, and the kind of exhausted eyes that came from working double shifts in an underfunded hospital that served a community constantly under siege. "You've lost a lot of blood. The bullet in your shoulder went clean through, which is lucky, but the one in your leg fragmented. I pulled out most of the pieces, but you're going to have metal in that thigh for the rest of your life." "How long?" Bumpy's voice came out as a croak, his throat raw and dry. "You've been unconscious for about 6 hours, the doctor said, checking a chart. "It's 4 in the morning. The police brought you in around 10 last night. They're outside waiting to talk to you, along with what seems like half of Harlem. Madame St. Clair tried to get in, but the cops have the floor locked down. Bumpy processed this information through the fog of pain and whatever drugs they'd given him. 6 hours was an eternity in his world, time enough for Schultz to have made a dozen moves, time enough for the balance of power to have shifted irrevocably. He needed to get out of here, needed to get back in the fight, but when he tried again to sit up, his body simply refused to cooperate. I said, "Don't move," the doctor repeated more firmly this time. "You move too much, you'll tear those stitches, and then we'll be doing this all over again. You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Johnson. Another inch to the right on that shoulder wound, and you'd have bled out on the street." "Lucky," Bumpy repeated, tasting the word like poison. That's one way to put it. The doctor moved closer, lowering his voice. "I know who you are. Everyone in Harlem knows who you are, and I'm going to tell you something as a doctor and as a black man living in this neighborhood. Whatever war you just started with Dutch Schultz, it's going to kill a lot of people, innocent people, people who just want to run their numbers, feed their families, and survive another day in this goddamn city." Bumpy met the doctor's eyes, saw the genuine concern there mixed with the frustration of someone who spent his days stitching up the casualties of a violence he couldn't control. "You think I don't know that? You think I wanted this?" "I think you're a smart man who made a choice," the doctor said, "and now we all have to live with the consequences, including the kid in the next room who caught a stray bullet that was probably meant for you." The words hit Bumpy harder than the actual bullets had. "What kid?" 8 years old, the doctor said, his voice heavy with anger. "Shot in the abdomen while playing stickball in the street. Schultz's men were shooting at shadows, at anyone who looked like they might be your people. They hit a child instead. He's alive, barely, but he'll be in surgery for the next 4 hours if we can keep him stable that long." Bumpy closed his eyes, feeling something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with his wounds. This was the calculus of violence in Harlem, the innocent math that meant every action had casualties beyond the intended targets. He'd known this, had always known this, but knowing it and feeling the weight of it were two different things. Before he could respond, the door to his room swung open and 2 white police officers walked in, their presence instantly changing the atmosphere from medical concern to hostile interrogation. They were both in their 30s, both with the kind of expressions that suggested they viewed everyone in Harlem as either criminals or criminal sympathizers. Ellsworth Johnson, the taller one, said, pulling out a notepad, "I'm Detective Morrison. This is Detective Kelly. We need to ask you some questions about what happened last night at the Cotton Club." Bumpy said nothing, just stared at them with the blank expression he'd perfected over years of police encounters. "We have witnesses who say you assaulted Dutch Schultz and one of his associates." Morrison continued, "We have other witnesses who say Schultz's men shot you in the street. We've got a war starting in Harlem, and we want to know who fired the first shot." "I want a lawyer," Bumpy said flatly. "Of course you do," Kelly said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You people always want lawyers. How about instead you tell us the truth about what happened? Help us prevent more bloodshed." "I want a lawyer," Bumpy repeated. Morrison sighed theatrically. "Here's what's going to happen, Johnson. You're going to be charged with assault and battery on Mr. Schultz, assault with a deadly weapon on his associate, and disturbing the peace. Given your record, you're looking at significant prison time. Now, we might be willing to reduce those charges if you cooperate, if you testify against some of the other troublemakers who've been causing problems for legitimate businessmen trying to operate in this neighborhood." The suggestion was so absurd, so divorced from the reality of how power actually worked in Harlem, that Bumpy almost laughed. Testify against his own people to protect Dutch Schultz, a white gangster who had called him a racial slur before trying to steal his livelihood. The police actually thought he would consider this. "I want a lawyer," Bumpy said for the 3rd time. Morrison's face hardened. "You're making a mistake. Dutch Schultz has connections you can't imagine, political connections. He's got city councilmen, judges, even people in the mayor's office. You think you can fight that? You're a street thug from Harlem. You're nothing." "If I'm nothing," Bumpy said, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge, "then why are you here trying to get me to flip? Why does Dutch Schultz need the police to do his fighting for him?" The question hung in the air, and Bumpy saw something flicker in Morrison's eyes, a momentary acknowledgement that Bumpy had scored a point. The truth was that Schultz did have connections, but those connections were worried. A black man standing up to white organized crime, refusing to be intimidated. That was a dangerous precedent, a crack in the racial hierarchy that kept the city's power structure intact. "You're under arrest," Morrison said finally. "As soon as the doc says you can be moved, you're going to the Tombs to await trial. And Johnson, you'd better hope Dutch Schultz doesn't send someone to finish the job while you're in there. We can't protect you 24 hours a day." The threat was barely veiled, and Bumpy understood the implication. Once he was in the city jail system, he would be vulnerable, isolated from his network, unable to coordinate with Madame St. Clair or his other associates. And there would be inmates on Schultz's payroll, men who would gladly kill him for the promise of money or reduced sentences. The detectives left and the doctor returned with fresh bandages and a morphine injection that Bumpy wanted to refuse but couldn't, the pain having become a living thing that consumed all his thoughts. As the drug began to take effect, dulling the edges of his agony, he felt his mind starting to drift, and he fought against it, trying to stay focused, trying to plan for what came next. But the morphine was insistent, pulling him down into a gray fog where time became elastic and thoughts became fragmentary. He dreamed of the Cotton Club, of the moment when he'd punched Dutch Schultz, and in the dream he kept hitting him over and over until the man's face dissolved into a bloody mask. He dreamed of the 8-year-old boy in the next room, could hear the child crying for his mother, could feel the weight of that suffering pressing down on his chest like a gravestone. When he woke again, it was daylight, pale sun filtering through the grimy hospital windows. His mouth tasted like copper and chemicals, and his body felt simultaneously numb and agonized, the morphine having worn off just enough to let the pain return, but not enough to restore full clarity of thought. A nurse was changing his bandages, a young Negro woman who worked with efficient, gentle hands. She didn't speak to him, probably had been instructed not to, but as she cleaned the wound in his shoulder, Bumpy saw her glance at the door and then lean close. Madame St. Clair says to hold on, she whispered. She says the war has begun, but Harlem stands with you. She says 8 men are already dead. Bumpy's blood ran cold. 8 men dead in less than 12 hours. The violence he had initiated, the war he had declared by refusing to bow to Schultz, had already claimed more lives than he'd imagined possible. Who? He managed to ask. 4 of Schultz's men, 3 of ours, and the child died in surgery an hour ago. The nurse's voice broke on the last sentence, and Bumpy saw tears forming in her eyes. His name was Thomas Williams. He was 8 years old. 3 days later, they transferred Bumpy Johnson to the Tombs, New York City's notorious detention complex that earned its name from the Egyptian revival architecture that made it look like a mausoleum for the living. The transport happened at dawn, with Bumpy shackled hand and foot despite his injuries, loaded into a police wagon with 5 other prisoners who recognized him immediately and gave him the kind of respectful distance that spoke to his reputation. The pain in his shoulder and leg had settled into a constant, grinding ache that morphine could dull but never eliminate. Moving was agony, and the shackles cut into his ankles where the bullet wound in his thigh was still trying to heal. But Bumpy had learned a long time ago that physical pain was just information, data that your body sent to your brain, and like all data, it could be acknowledged and then set aside in service of more important things. The Tombs smelled like every jail he'd ever been in, unwashed bodies, disinfectant that didn't quite mask the stench of human waste, despair soaked into concrete walls. They processed him with bureaucratic indifference, taking his fingerprints, his photograph, cataloging his injuries with all the warmth of someone documenting livestock. Then they threw him into a cell on the 3rd tier, a 6 by 8 foot cage with a metal cot, a bucket for a toilet, and one small window too high to reach and too grimy to see through clearly. He was alone, which was both a blessing and a strategic move by the authorities. In the general population, he would have had allies, connections, the ability to gather information and coordinate with the outside world. In isolation, he was cut off, dependent entirely on his own resources, his own mental strength. The first night was the hardest. The morphine had completely worn off, and the pain was so intense that Bumpy couldn't find a position on the thin mattress that didn't make him want to scream. His shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, and his leg felt like it was filled with broken glass. But worse than the physical pain was the knowledge of what was happening outside these walls, the war he had started but couldn't fight, the people dying in his name while he lay helpless in a cell. He thought about Thomas Williams, the 8-year-old boy who had been playing stickball in the street, thought about the child's mother whom he'd never met but could picture with perfect clarity, a woman who had woken up that morning thinking her biggest worry was feeding her family, only to have her son torn away by violence she had no part in creating. Thought about the 3 operators who had died in the first wave of Schultz's retaliation, men whose names he knew, whose families he had met, whose deaths were on his hands as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger himself. The guilt was crushing, heavier than any physical burden, and Bumpy understood in that moment why so many men broke in solitary confinement. It wasn't the isolation or the discomfort or even the fear. It was the inability to escape your own thoughts, to run from the consequences of your choices, to distract yourself from the weight of responsibility. But Bumpy Johnson hadn't survived 30 years in the most dangerous neighborhood in America by giving in to despair. He had survived by being smarter, tougher, and more determined than everyone else. And he wasn't about to let a cell break what poverty, racism, and violence hadn't managed to destroy. On the 2nd day, he began to establish a routine. Physical exercise was out of the question with his injuries, but he could exercise his mind, and that's where the real battle would be won or lost. He started by reconstructing everything he knew about Dutch Schultz's organization, mapping it out in his head with the precision of a military strategist. He knew Schultz's lieutenants, knew their territories, knew their weaknesses and their strengths. He thought about supply lines, about how the numbers racket actually functioned, about choke points and vulnerabilities. Then he turned his attention to his own organization, to Madame St. Clair's network of operators, collectors, and enforcers. He thought about who could be trusted, who might turn under pressure, who dared to fight, and who would fold. He thought about allies, about the other black gangsters and entrepreneurs who shared his hatred of the Italian syndicates, about whether this war could be expanded beyond just his own crew to include a broader coalition. The thinking was methodical, almost meditative. Each day he would work through a different aspect of the problem, turning it over in his mind from every angle, looking for solutions, for strategies, for ways to turn his disadvantages into advantages. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and locked in a cell, but he had something Schultz didn't have. He understood Harlem. He understood the loyalty of people who had been oppressed for so long that they would rather die fighting than live on their knees. On the fourth day, he received his first visitor. The guard who came to get him was a young Irish cop who looked at Bumpy with something between fear and respect, and when he opened the cell door, he kept his hand on his nightstick ready for trouble. "You've got 15 minutes, the guard said, leading Bumpy down the tier, his shackles forcing him to shuffle in small, painful steps. "And if you try anything, I'll crack your skull open, injured or not." "No trouble," Bumpy said quietly. They led him to a visiting room divided by a mesh screen, and on the other side sat Madame Stephanie St. Clair, looking as regal and composed as ever despite the circumstances. She was dressed in an expensive dress, her hair perfectly styled, her face made up with the kind of care that suggested she refused to let the world see her as anything less than royalty. But Bumpy could see the strain in her eyes, the exhaustion behind the facade. They picked up the phones on either side of the mesh, and for a moment they just looked at each other, two survivors who had built an empire together and were now watching it burn. "8 men," she said finally, her accent making the words sound almost musical despite their weight. "Thomas Williams, 3 of our people, 4 of Schultz's, and the week isn't over yet." "I know," Bumpy said, "the nurse told me." "The neighborhood is terrified," Stephanie continued. "Schultz has men on every corner collecting protection money, threatening anyone who resists. He's claiming you're finished, that with you in jail, there's no one left to protect them." "Are they believing him?" Stephanie smiled, and it was fierce. "Some are, but not most. You hit Schultz in front of witnesses, Bumpy. You stood up to him when everyone else was bowing down. That matters. That gives people hope, even if they're scared." "Hope doesn't stop bullets," Bumpy said. "No," Stephanie agreed, "but it's a start. I've been making moves, consolidating our people, reaching out to allies. The Black Brotherhood has agreed to work with us. So has Cookie Thompson's crew from Sugar Hill. We're not as isolated as Schultz thinks we are." Bumpy felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. If Stephanie could rally enough support, if she could turn this from a personal conflict into a broader war between Black Harlem and white organized crime, then maybe they had a chance. "What about the police?" he asked. "Bought and paid for by Schultz," Stephanie said. "They're not even pretending to be neutral anymore, but that works in our favor. Every time they side with Schultz against our people, they prove that the system is rigged, that we can't rely on law and order, that we have to protect ourselves." "They're charging me with assault," Bumpy said. "Morrison says I'm looking at 5 years, maybe more." "I've hired the best lawyer money can buy," Stephanie said. "Benjamin Davis Jr., the Negro attorney who got that acquittal last year in the Bronx murder case. He thinks he can get the charges reduced, maybe even dismissed, if we can prove you were acting in self-defense." "I wasn't acting in self-defense," Bumpy said bluntly. "I hit Schultz because he disrespected our people. A judge isn't going to see that as self-defense." "Then we'll find another angle," Stephanie said, her voice hard with determination. "You're not going to prison for 5 years, Bumpy. I need you out here. Harlem needs you out here." They talked for another 10 minutes, Stephanie filling him in on specific details of the war, which operators had stood firm and which had folded, which blocks were still under their control, and which had been lost to Schultz's incursion. Bumpy listened carefully, filing away every piece of information, building a mental map of the battlefield. When the guard came to end the visit, Stephanie stood, placing her palm flat against the mesh screen. Bumpy raised his own hand to meet hers, separated by wire and institutional paranoia, but connected by something deeper than physical touch. "Hold on," she said. "Just hold on. We're coming for you." Back in the cell, Bumpy lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since the shooting, he allowed himself to feel something other than pain and guilt. He felt pride. Pride in Stephanie for holding the organization together, pride in the people of Harlem for not immediately surrendering to Schultz's threats, pride in himself for having the courage to start a war even though he knew the cost would be high. The days began to blur together after that, each one following the same pattern. Wake to pain, exercise his mind through strategic thinking, receive occasional updates through Stephanie's visits or messages smuggled in by sympathetic guards, sleep fitfully, and wake to pain again. His body was healing slowly, the wounds knitting together with the reluctant cooperation of damaged tissue, but he knew the scars would be permanent, both physical and psychological. On the 10th day, something changed. He was lying on his cot working through a particularly complex scenario involving how to disrupt Schultz supply chains when he heard shouting from the tier below. It was followed by what sounded like gunshots, though the sound was muffled by concrete and distance. Then more shouting, then an alarm that turned the tombs into a cacophony of noise and confusion. Bumpy stood carefully, moving to the door of his cell, trying to see what was happening. Guards were running past, their faces showing the kind of panic that came when order broke down in a place that depended entirely on order for its function. He could hear prisoners yelling from their cells, could hear what sounded like fighting, metal on metal, bodies hitting concrete. A riot, he realized. Someone had started a riot in the tombs. The riot at the tombs lasted 4 hours and left 3 prisoners dead, 7 guards injured, and an entire tier of cells damaged beyond immediate repair. Bumpy had remained in his cell throughout, listening to the chaos, understanding that this violence was somehow connected to him to the larger war raging in Harlem, though he couldn't determine the exact connections until later. When the lawyers finally came 2 days after the riot had been suppressed, they brought news that changed everything. Benjamin Davis, Jr. was exactly as Stephanie had described him, impeccably dressed, brilliantly educated, and possessed of the kind of controlled rage that came from being a black man with a law degree in a country that barely acknowledged his humanity. He sat across from Bumpy in a private consultation room, spreading out documents on the table with precise economical movements. The assault charges have been dropped, Davis said without preamble. The district attorney's office has decided not to prosecute based on insufficient evidence and conflicting witness testimony. Bumpy stared at him, waiting for the catch, because in his experience, good news always came with conditions. Dutch Schultz is dead, Davis continued, and Bumpy felt the world tilt sideways. He was shot 3 times in the bathroom of the Palace Chop House in Newark 2 days ago. The shooters got him, his accountant, and 2 bodyguards. He died yesterday at the hospital. The word on the street is that it was a hit ordered by Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, who were tired of Schultz's unpredictability and his war with Harlem. Bumpy processed this information slowly, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle with missing pieces. Schultz dead. The war ended not by his hand or Stephanie's, but by the very Italian syndicate that Schultz had thought would support him. The irony was almost poetic. The riot, Bumpy asked. None related as far as we can determine, Davis said, though the timing is convenient. With Schultz gone, his organization is collapsing. His lieutenants are either being absorbed into other crews or being eliminated. The pressure on Harlem has lifted almost overnight. Just like that, Bumpy said quietly. All those people died, and just like that, it's over. Davis met his eyes with the kind of understanding that came from someone who had seen the same patterns play out again and again. It's never really over, Mr. Johnson. The system that allowed Schultz to threaten Harlem, that gave him police protection and political connections, that system is still in place. Another Dutch Schultz will come along eventually, but for now you've won something important. You've shown that black people in Harlem won't be intimidated, won't be enslaved, won't go quietly into the subjugation that society has planned for them. 3 days later, they released Bumpy Johnson from the tombs. He walked out into a crisp October morning, his shoulder still stiff, his leg aching with every step, wearing the same blood-stained suit he'd been arrested in because his other clothes had been lost in the chaos of that night. Stephanie was waiting for him in a car at the curb, and when he slid into the back seat, she said nothing, just handed him a flask of whiskey and instructed the driver to take them to Harlem. They drove north through Manhattan, and Bumpy watched the city change around them, watched the buildings get shorter and more crowded, watched the faces on the street shift from predominantly white to predominantly black, watched his kingdom come back into view. When they crossed into Harlem proper, turning onto Lenox Avenue, he saw something that made his throat tighten. People were lining the streets, dozens of them, then hundreds, standing outside their shops and apartments, watching the car pass. And as he watched, they began to nod, to raise their hands in acknowledgement, to show respect in the quiet, dignified way that was more powerful than any loud celebration. They know what you did, Stephanie said softly. They know you stood up to Schultz. They know you were willing to die rather than bow down. That means something to them, Bumpy. It means everything. The car stopped in front of Stephanie's brownstone, and Bumpy got out slowly, feeling the weight of all those eyes on him, feeling the responsibility of their respect. An older woman, someone he recognized as the mother of one of the men who had died in the first week of the war, approached him. She was crying, but she reached out and touched his hand. "Thank you," she said. "My son died free. He died fighting. That's more than most of us get." Bumpy wanted to apologize, wanted to tell her that her son's death was his fault, that if he had just taken Schultz's deal, her boy would still be alive. But he understood, looking into her tear-stained face, that she didn't want his apology. She wanted him to make her son's death mean something, to make the sacrifice part of a larger narrative of resistance and dignity. "I won't forget him," Bumpy said quietly. "I won't forget any of them." Inside the brownstone, Stephanie had prepared a room for him to recover, a space with clean sheets, hot food, and most importantly, privacy. She left him alone, and Bumpy sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands, thinking about everything that had happened. 8 men died in the first week. Thomas Williams, 8 years old, is playing stickball. 3 of his own people who had trusted him to protect them. 4 of Schultz's men were just following orders, just trying to survive in a violent world. And Schultz himself was shot down in a bathroom by people who saw him as a liability rather than as a victim of Harlem's resistance. The violence hadn't brought justice. It hadn't created equality or fixed the broken system that had pitted communities against each other. All it had done was shift the balance of power slightly, temporarily, in a way that would inevitably shift back. But as Bumpy sat there, he realized that Davis had been right. It wasn't about winning permanently. It was about refusing to lose quietly. It was about standing up and saying with your actions rather than your words that your dignity was non-negotiable, that your humanity was not up for debate, that you would rather die fighting than live as a slave. Over the following weeks, as his body continued to heal and Harlem settled into an uneasy peace, Bumpy found himself thinking differently about power and violence and resistance. He had always believed that strength meant the ability to hurt others, to impose one's will through force. But now he understood that true strength was something more complex, something that involved carrying the weight of consequences without breaking enduring pain, without losing yourself, maintaining your humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The scars on his shoulder and leg became part of his legend, physical evidence of the night he had stood up to Dutch Schultz and survived. People would ask to see them, would touch them with reverence, would tell stories about the bullets that couldn't kill Bumpy Johnson. And he would let them, understanding that the scars belonged not just to him, but to everyone in Harlem who needed a symbol of resistance. But in private moments, alone with his thoughts, Bumpy would touch those scars and remember different things. He would remember Thomas Williams, would carry the weight of that child's death like a stone in his chest. He would remember the 3 operators who had died in his war, visit their families and make sure they were taken care of. He would remember the young man who had stood over him with a gun, ready to deliver the execution shot, and wonder what had become of him after Schultz's death. Madame St. Clair's organization grew stronger in the aftermath of the war, consolidating control over Harlem's numbers, racket in a way that would have been impossible before. Bumpy became her chief enforcer, her strategist, the man people feared and respected in equal measure. But he carried his power differently now, with a weariness that came from understanding its true cost. One night, 6 months after his release from the tombs, Bumpy stood on the roof of Stephanie's brownstone, looking out over Harlem. The lights of the city stretched out before him, thousands of lives playing out in those tenements and brownstones, each one a story of struggle and survival and hope against all odds. He thought about the system that had created Dutch Schultz, that had created the poverty and desperation, that made the numbers racket necessary, that had created the racism that made men like him simultaneously powerful and powerless. He thought about how violence was a symptom rather than a disease, how fighting men like Schultz was necessary but not sufficient, how real change would require something more fundamental than gang wars and street justice. But he also thought about the people who had lined the streets when he returned from jail, about the respect in their eyes, about the mother who had thanked him for letting her son die free. He thought about the fact that for a brief moment, Harlem had stood together against external oppression, had refused to be divided and conquered, and had shown that black people could organize and resist and fight for their own interests. That was worth something. Maybe not everything, maybe not enough to justify the deaths and the suffering, but something. A voice behind him interrupted his thoughts. Stephanie had come up to the roof, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill. She stood beside him, looking out at the same view, and for a long moment they said nothing. "Do you regret it?" she asked finally, standing up to Schultz, starting the war. Bumpy considered the question carefully, turning it over in his mind the way he had learned to do during his time in the tombs. Did he regret it? The deaths, certainly. The suffering, absolutely. But the act itself, the moment when he had looked Dutch Schultz in the eye and refused to bow, when he had claimed his dignity even at the cost of his safety. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it, because the alternative was living on my knees, and I've learned something important. A man who dies on his feet dies only once, but a man who lives on his knees dies 1,000 deaths every day until there's nothing left of him but a shell." Stephanie nodded as if this was the answer she had expected. The neighborhood is changing. The people are changing. They're starting to believe that they don't have to accept whatever white society decides to give them. That's dangerous, Bumpy. That's the kind of belief that starts revolutions. "Good," Bumpy said. "Let it be dangerous. Let them be afraid of us for once instead of the other way around." They stood together on that roof, 2 people who had survived wars, both literal and metaphorical, who had refused to be broken by a world designed to break them, who had carved out a space for dignity and power in a society that denied both to people who looked like them. Below them, Harlem lived and breathed and struggled and survived as it always had, as it always would. And Bumpy Johnson, with his scars and his pain and his hard-won wisdom, stood watch over it all. A guardian who understood that protection sometimes required violence, that peace sometimes required war, and that dignity always required the willingness to fight for it no matter the cost. The wounds had healed, but the scars remained, and in those scars was written a story that would be told for generations, the story of a man who refused to bow, who stood up to power, even when power seemed invincible, who understood that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight knowing you might lose, because the act of fighting is itself a victory. In the years that followed, Bumpy Johnson would face many more challenges, spend time in prison, and continue to navigate the dangerous waters of organized crime and racial politics. But he would never forget the lesson he learned during those weeks in 1935, when 8 men died and a war was won not through superior force, but through superior will. The lesson was simple. Your dignity is yours to keep or surrender, and no one can take it from you unless you give it away. Dutch Schultz had tried to take it with threats and violence and racial slurs. The police had tried to take it with arrests and intimidation. The system had tried to take it with poverty, segregation, and oppression. But Bumpy Johnson, lying bleeding in a Harlem street, locked in a cell in the Tombs, standing on a roof looking out over his kingdom, had kept his dignity intact. And in keeping it, he had shown others that it was possible, that resistance was not futile, that the fight itself was worthwhile, even when victory seemed impossible. That was his legacy. That was what the scars meant. That was what the people in the street had been acknowledging when they nodded and raised their hands as his car passed. Not that he had won, but that he had fought. Not that he was invincible, but that he was unbowed. Not that the system was defeated, but that one man in one moment had refused to accept what the system had decreed was his place. And sometimes in a world built on injustice, that refusal is the most revolutionary act of all.